In the previous section, we explored how a property must be clearly identified within a purchase contract to satisfy the statute of frauds and ensure enforceability. Now, we expand on that foundation by examining the essential elements that make any real estate contract valid and binding under Arizona law. These elements, legal capacity, competent parties, lawful purpose, certain specificity, and mutual assent, must all exist together. If even one is missing, the contract may be void or unenforceable. These principles apply to all real estate contracts, whether for the purchase of residential property, commercial land, or vacant parcels, and they ensure that transactions reflect fairness, consent, and legal certainty. The first element, legal capacity, refers to the ability of each party to enter into a binding agreement. In Arizona, any person over the age of 18 who is of sound mind has the legal capacity to contract. Minors generally cannot enter into binding real estate contracts, though exceptions exist for emancipated minors or contracts ratified upon reaching adulthood. For example, if a 17-year-old signs a purchase contract to buy land, the contract is voidable at their discretion because they lack full legal capacity. However, if the same individual reaffirms the agreement after turning 18, it becomes binding. Additionally, legal capacity extends to entities such as corporations, limited liability companies, LLCs, and trusts, which must have duly authorized signatories. Under Commissioner's Rule R4-28-11-11H, brokers must ensure that individuals signing for an entity are properly authorized to do so, as failing to confirm authority may result in an unenforceable agreement or disciplinary action. It is also important to verify that the seller or buyer is authorized to sell or purchase a property. One such case, a seller who did not own the property sold it to a buyer. When the daughter of the property found out she had a long court case ahead to get the property back for her father. The second essential element is competent parties. While similar to legal capacity, competence refers to the mental and emotional state of each party at the time of signing. A person under duress, coercion, or the influence of drugs or alcohol may lack competence. Arizona courts have long held that a contract entered into by an incompetent party is voidable. For example, in a transaction where an elderly seller is pressured by a relative to sell their home at a fraction of its value, the court may rescind the contract if evidence shows undue influence or diminished capacity. Competence ensures that all parties genuinely understand the nature and consequences of their agreement, reinforcing the principle of mutual assent. The third requirement, lawful purpose, ensures that all real estate contracts are grounded in legality and public policy. A contract to sell property must serve a lawful purpose and cannot be based on illegal activity or fraud. For example, a contract to sell property intended for unlawful gambling operations or unpermitted marijuana cultivation would be void because it violates state and federal law. Arizona courts consistently refuse to enforce agreements that contradict public policy, as illustrated in Mountain State's Bolt, Nut, and Screw Cumber v. Bestway Transportation, 1979, where contracts promoting illegal actions were deemed unenforceable. In real estate, lawful purpose also extends to ensuring that property use complies with zoning, deed restrictions, and environmental laws. The fourth element, certain specificity, builds upon the property identification concept from the prior section. A valid contract must be specific about its essential terms, price, property description, and key obligations. Vague terms, such as to be determined or subject to agreement later, can invalidate a contract because they lack definiteness. Arizona courts have emphasized that for a contract to be enforceable, the obligations of both parties must be clearly defined so that a court can determine whether each performed their duties. In a real-world example, if a seller agrees to sell my property at a fair market price without specifying an amount, the contract may be unenforceable because fair market price is open to interpretation. The court would have no way to determine the actual terms agreed upon. Certainty ensures clarity and reduces the likelihood of disputes or litigation. The final and perhaps most important element is mutual assent, often referred to as a meeting of the minds. Mutual assent occurs when both parties fully understand and agree to the essential terms of the contract, including the price, property, and conditions. Offers and acceptances must mirror one another. Any change to the terms creates a counteroffer rather than acceptance. This principle is central to contract formation. In Hill versus Jones, 1986, mutual assent was highlighted when the buyers claimed they were unaware of defects in the property. Although the case centered on disclosure, it reinforced that valid consent requires full understanding and agreement regarding all material facts. Without mutual assent, even a written contract can be void because the parties did not truly agree on the same terms. Consider a scenario where a buyer submits an offer to purchase a Scottsdale home for $500,000, but the seller counters at $515,000. If the buyer signs the counteroffer, mutual assent is achieved. However, if the buyer signs the original offer rather than the counter, no meeting of the minds has occurred, and no valid contract exists. Mutual assent requires good faith and fair dealing in contract formation and execution. In Arizona, all these elements, legal capacity, competent parties, lawful purpose, certain specificity, and mutual assent, work together to ensure enforceable contracts that can withstand scrutiny by the courts. When one is missing, the contract may be void, voidable, or unenforceable. For example, a contract signed by an unauthorized agent lacking legal capacity, or one missing key terms, lacking certainty, cannot be upheld. Brokers and licensees must recognize these elements when drafting, reviewing, or explaining contracts to clients, as required under ARS. Paragraph 32-153 and Commissioner's Rule R428-1101I, which emphasize reasonable care, honesty, and accuracy. Discussion: why must parties to a real estate contract possess both legal capacity and competence? Answer: because these conditions ensure that each party understands and voluntarily consents to the agreement, preventing contracts from being signed under incapacity, coercion, or misunderstanding. What happens when a real estate contract lacks definite and certain terms? Answer: the contract may be unenforceable because the court cannot determine the obligations or intent of the parties, leading to a void or voidable agreement. How does mutual assent relate to the concept of a meeting of the minds? Answer: mutual assent occurs when both parties agree to the same terms and conditions without misunderstanding, forming the foundation of a valid, enforceable contract. Review summary: a valid real estate contract in Arizona must satisfy 5 essential elements to be enforceable: legal capacity, competent parties, lawful purpose, certain specificity, and mutual assent. Legal capacity ensures that parties are of age and have authority to act. Competence guarantees that decisions are made knowingly and freely. Lawful purpose ensures the agreement does not violate state or federal law. Certain specificity clarifies the essential terms, such as property, price, and conditions. And mutual assent creates true agreement between the parties. Together, these elements uphold the integrity of real estate transactions, ensuring fairness, transparency, and enforceability. Brokers and licensees play a crucial role in verifying that each element is present before proceeding, as missing or defective elements can render a contract invalid or subject to legal challenge.